Hello, welcome to the 190 Literary and Jury Charge Selection. I'm going to start off with a small article, and this is called Make Peace with Imperfection. Ready? I've yet to meet an absolute perfectionist whose life was filled with inner peace. The need for perfection and the desire for inner tranquility conflict with each other. Whenever we are attached to having something a certain way, better than it already is, we are, almost by definition, engaged in a losing battle. Rather than being content and grateful for what we have, we are focused on what's wrong with something and our need to fix it. When we are zoned in on what's wrong, it implies that we are dissatisfied or discontent, whether it's related to ourselves, a disorganized closet, a scratch on the car, an imperfect accomplishment, a few pounds that we would like to lose, or someone else's imperfections, the way someone looks, behaves, or lives their life. The very act of focusing on imperfection pulls us away from our goal of being kind and gentle. This strategy has nothing to do with ceasing to do your very best, but with being overly attached and focused on what's wrong with life. It's about realizing that while there's always a better way to do something, this doesn't mean that you can't enjoy and appreciate the way things already are. The solution here is to catch yourself when you fall into your habit of insisting that things should be other than they are. Gently remind yourself that life is okay the way it is right now. In the absence of your judgment, everything would be fine. As you begin to eliminate your need for perfection in all areas of your life, you'll begin to discover the perfection in life itself. Okay, I have some jury charge for you. The subject is damages. Ready? Ladies and gentlemen, the court instructs the jury that just compensation must be determined upon the evidence under the instructions of the court and not upon the statements of counsel outside of the evidence, if any such statements have been made. Furthermore, you are not bound to believe anything to be a fact simply because a witness stated it to be so, provided you believe from all the evidence that such witness is mistaken or has testified falsely as to such fact. The damages, if any, to be awarded to the plaintiff are solely by way of compensation for pecuniary loss suffered by the parents of the deceased. You can allow no damages for pain and suffering of the deceased, nor can you allow any damages for the grief or mental suffering of the parents caused by the death of their son. The test is, in view of all the facts shown by the evidence, what was the probable pecuniary interest of the parents in the continuation of the life of the deceased? Under the law, a probable estimate may be arrived at by taking into account the occupation of the deceased and the income which he enjoyed, his health, age, and the probable duration of life of the survivors. Also the talents of the deceased, his habits of industry, his success in life, and the amount of aid in money or services which he was accustomed to furnish to his parents. This estimate you will arrive at from the evidence in the case. The parents had a legal claim upon the deceased for their support, and it is presumed that they suffered some pecuniary loss. The amount of such loss is for the jury to determine. If the plaintiff is entitled to recover in this case, he is entitled to recover, in addition to the pecuniary loss already referred to, the reasonable value of doctor bills, funeral expenses, and all other disbursements paid out as a result of the death. Okay. I have an article here. This is called Probation Kiosks, High-Tech Supervision. Ready? In 2007, probation authorities in New York City began experimenting with the use of probation kiosks designed to lower probation officer caseloads. 15 electronic kiosks, similar in design to automated teller machines, were soon scattered throughout the city. They allow probationers to check in with probation officers by placing their palms on a specially designed surface and by answering questions presented on a flashing screen. The kiosks identify probationers by the shape and size of their hands, which were previously scanned into the system. Probationers are then prompted to press yes or no in response to questions like these. Have you moved recently? Have you been arrested again? Do you need to see a probation officer? Meetings with officers can be scheduled directly from the kiosk. Probation officers use a computer to monitor data sent from the kiosks and can zero in on individual probationers who are having problems, prompting more personal attention. By the time the system is fully operational, as many as 30,000 low-risk probationers, about 1/3 of New York City's total, will report through kiosks. Kiosks have already yielded positive results, according to New York City probation officer Jeannie Bogans. Before the kiosks, says Bogans, she was swamped by the administrative details required to track the 250 offenders in her caseload. Kiosks allow her to track nonviolent older offenders with a minimum of time and effort, and she now focuses most of her attention on the relatively few violent youths who are also part of her caseload, meeting with them and their families twice weekly in small group sessions. Bogans even goes to family funerals and graduations, making youthful offenders feel like they are getting special attention. But it can be done only when you have 30 cases as opposed to 200, says Bogans. New York's use of kiosks is being watched closely by other probation and parole agencies around the country as they face swelling caseloads and shrinking budgets. Some jurisdictions, like Marion County, Indiana, have installed similar machines. Under its expedited caseload program, Marion County, home to the city of Indianapolis, reports lowering the number of hours required of its probation officers for caseload supervision. Since its inception, says county officials, the expedited caseload program, which accepts offenders convicted of nonviolent and less serious crimes, has taken more than 650 cases that would have otherwise gone to the regular probation caseloads. This is a savings of between 15 and 20 cases per casework officer over a 2-month period. The most recently available statistics show that about 4 million probationers were monitored through the kiosks in 2011. Other jurisdictions have taken different steps to automate their probation systems. Denver and Seattle, for example, are using 900 numbers through which probationers can report. However, critics charge that without personal supervision, probationers are more likely to reoffend, an assertion that is essentially untested. Other opponents say kiosks, 900 numbers, and similar reporting initiatives are far removed from meaningful punishment and that offenders deserve stricter treatment. Supporters, on the other hand, say that kiosk and 900 numbers will soon become more commonplace. New York City had no choice. It had to do something like that, says Todd Clear, professor of criminal justice at New York's John Jay College. Clear assisted the city in restructuring its probation program. No one wants probationers reporting to kiosks, but the alternative was even more unthinkable, a system in which nobody receives quality service, said Clear. Okay, I have an article. It's called Just Like You. Ready? By the time I was a junior in high school, 2 very important things had happened in my life. The first was that I'd fallen in love with a young man named Cody. He was a senior, he was a football player, and he was great. I knew that this was the young man I wanted to marry and have children with. Unfortunately, there was a serious problem. Cody didn't know I existed, nor did he know that we had plans. The second important thing was that I decided I did not want any more surgeries on my hands. I was born with 6 fingers on each hand and no knuckles. I had started having surgery on my hands when I was 6 months old and had 27 surgeries by the time I was 16. The surgeons had taken away the extra fingers, shortened some fingers, and created knuckles. I had been a young specimen paraded at times in front of up to 500 hand surgeons. While my hands were still not normal, I was done. At 16, I figured I had the right to say, "Leave my body alone." My family supported my decision, telling me I could have more surgeries as an adult. But I thought, nope, I don't need any more. This is how my hands will be, and that was that. Growing up, I had a friend named Jacob. We had gone to school together since first grade, and we were like best friends. One afternoon, Jacob came over to my house, and we started talking about the junior-senior prom that was coming up, and our plans to stay out all night on prom night. We had no idea what we were going to do all night, but we were very excited about staying out. Out of the blue, Jacob looked at me and said, "You really like Cody a lot, don't you?" I answered, "Yes, I really do." "But you know, Chelsea, there's a big problem. Cody is never going to want you," Jacob continued. "Why not?" I asked. "I know. I will dye my hair blonde," I thought to myself. "I know how that works." No, I know. I'll become a cheerleader. Everybody wants cheerleaders." But Jacob said, "Chelsea, you really don't understand. Cody is never going to want you because you are deformed." I heard it, I believed it, I lived it. His words struck me. I became a first grade teacher because I thought that would be a good place for someone with a deformity. My first year teaching, I had a little girl in my classroom named Felicia. She was the most gorgeous little girl I'd ever seen in my life. One afternoon, we were all working on learning to write our A's. To a first grader, that means a big, fat red pencil, lined green paper, and a concentrated effort to move the pencil all the way around and pull down. The classroom was very quiet as everyone worked diligently. I looked over at Felicia as I did so often, and I saw that she was writing with her fingers crossed. I tiptoed over to her, bent down and whispered, "Felicia, why are you writing with your fingers crossed?" This little girl looked up at me with her enormous, beautiful eyes, and she said, "Because, Mrs. Price, I want to be just like you." Felicia never saw a deformity, only a specialness she wanted for herself. Every one of us has something we consider to be not okay, to be a deformity. We can consider ourselves deformed, or we can see ourselves as special, and that choice will determine how we live our lives. That was a neat article. Okay. I've got an article here. It's called "The Search for Causes of Criminal Behavior." Okay, ready? The neutralization approach of Gresham, Sykes, and David Matza centers on rationalizations that allows offenders to shed feelings of guilt and responsibility for their behavior. Sykes and Matza believed that most people drift into and out of criminal behavior, but will not commit a crime unless they have available to them techniques of neutralization. Their study primarily concerned juveniles for whom, they suggested, neutralization techniques provided only a temporary respite from guilt. That respite, however, lasted long enough to avoid the twinges of conscience while a crime was being committed. Neutralization techniques include the following. 1. Denial of responsibility. For example, "I'm a product of my background." 2. Denial of injury. Example, "No one was really hurt." 3. Denial of the victim. Example, "They deserved it." 4. Condemnation of the condemners. Example, "The cops are corrupt." 5. Appeal to higher loyalties. Example, I did it for my friends. Like containment theory, restraint theories tend to depend on a general agreement as to values, or they assume that offenders are simply conformists who suffer temporary lapses. Neutralization techniques, by definition, are only needed when the delinquent has been socialized into middle-class values or where conscience is well developed. Even so, neutralization techniques do not in themselves explain crime. Such techniques are available to us all if we make only a slight effort to conjure them up. The real question is why some people choose to allow pro-offered neutralizations to affect their behavior, while others effortlessly discount them. Then there is the labeling theory. The labeling theory is a social process perspective that sees continued crime as a conscience of the limited opportunities or consequence for acceptable behavior that follow from the negative responses of society to those defined as offenders. The worth of any theory of behavior is proved by how well it reflects the reality of the social world. In practice, however, theoretical perspectives find acceptance in the academic environment via a number of considerations. Labeling theory, for example, became fashionable in the 1960s. Its popularity may have been due to the more cultural environment into which it was introduced, rather than to any inherent quality of the theory itself. Labeling theory was first introduced by Frank Tannenbaum in 1938 under the rubric of tagging. He wrote, "The young delinquent becomes bad because he is defined as bad, and because he is not believed if he is good." He went on to say, "The process of making the criminal, therefore, is a process of tagging. It becomes a way of stimulating and evolving the very traits that are complained of. The person becomes the thing he is described as being." Tannenbaum focused on society's power to define an act or an individual as bad and drew attention to the group need for a scapegoat in explaining the crime. The search for causes inherent in individuals was not yet exhausted, however, and Tannenbaum's theory fell mostly on deaf ears. By the 1960s, the social and academic environments in America had changed, and the issue of responsibility was seen more in terms of the group than the individual. In his book, The Outsiders, published in 1963, Howard Becker pointed out that criminality is not a quality inherent in an act or in a person. Crime, said Becker, results from a social definition through law of unacceptable behavior. That definition arises through moral enterprise, by which groups on both sides of an issue debate and eventually legislate their notion of what is moral and what is not. Becker wrote, "The central fact about deviance is that it is created by society. Social groups create deviance by making the rules whose infraction constitutes deviance. The criminal label, however, produces consequences for labeled individuals that may necessitate continued criminality." In describing the criminal career, Becker wrote, "To be labeled a criminal, one need only commit a single criminal offense, yet the word carries a number of connotations specifying auxiliary traits characteristic of anyone bearing the label. The first time a person commits a crime, the behavior is called primary deviance and may be a merely transitory form of behavior. However, in the popular mind, a known criminal is not to be trusted, should not be hired because of the potential for crimes on the job, and would not be a good candidate for the military, marriage, or any position that required responsibility. Society's tendency towards such thinking, Becker suggested, closes the legitimate opportunities, ensuring that the only new behavioral alternatives available to the labeled criminal are deviant ones. Succeeding episodes of criminal behavior are seen as a form of secondary deviance that eventually becomes stabilized in the behavioral repertoire and self-concept of the labeled person. Labeling theory can be critiqued along a number of dimensions. First, it is not really a theory in that labeling does not uncover the genesis of criminal behavior. It is more useful in describing how such behavior continues than in explaining how it originates. Second, labeling theory does not recognize the possibility that the labeled individual may make successful attempts at reform and may shed the negative label. Finally, the theory does not provide an effective way of dealing with offenders. Should people who commit crimes not be arrested and tried so as to avoid the consequences of negative labels? It would be exceedingly naive to suggest that all repeat criminal behavior would cease, as labeling theory might predict, if people who commit crimes are not officially handled by the system. And that concludes our literary and jury charge for the 190 class. Have a great day.